14 in our study. Verses 11 through 15, though, I titled that section, Political Council in Egypt to Fall. That the wise counselors, the wisdom that Egypt was known for, it's become foolish. It's of no value because they cannot tell them what God's going to do. Now, Isaiah had, if they would have listened to him. But if they would have listened to him, they could have prevented it to begin with. So verse 14, the Lord hath mingled a perverse spirit in the midst thereof, and they have caused Egypt to err in every work thereof, as a drunken man staggereth in his vomit. God has brought this perverse spirit to them. They have misrepresented God's dealings at every step. It reminds me a little bit about denominations today. Don't they misrepresent God at just about every step? And some of these are very smart. They're very wise, even from a biblical standpoint. And still, they will misrepresent God. I'll give one illustration, or a couple. A.T. Robertson has a grammar on Greek that is about yay thick. It's something around 1,000 pages. Now that's just on Greek grammar. Basically the grammar that's found in the Bible. And yet when he comes to Acts 2 and verse 38, and the Greek word ace or ice, he knows what it means, and basically he doesn't care. And he goes against what his scholarship tells him so that he can hold on to, he was a Baptist, and Baptist theology, and thus will misrepresent God along those lines. And by the way, that's just his grammar. He also has a series of books covering the entire New Testament, dealing with every book of the New Testament. Brilliant man, and yet misrepresents God. Several years ago, trying to remember how many, and I don't remember how many, but I put up quotes by the head of a Baptist theology seminar, and I'll be nice and not call it a cemetery, which is what it really is, but regarding Romans 6, 3 and 4, and then also I think it was Colossians 2 and verse 12. And if you read that, you could not find anything better as far as teaching those passages. And yet he'll turn right around and deny what they say and what he has said in the exegesis of it in order to hold to his Baptist theology. Now then, how is that not misrepresenting God? We could go through a lot of illustrations, but people simply misrepresent God. The Egyptian wise men had misrepresented God and his dealings with them. The idea of mingled there in the first part of the verse is basically the same image as drunken in the latter part of the verse.
Must have got a hold of some of this drink, H.E. Robinson, and that Baptist guy he's talking about. Some of this drink he
Maybe so.
How can people like that not worry about their soul? They know all of that about what the Greek says, and they know what's going to happen if they don't obey it. And yet, they still refuse to. I just shudder to think about that.
It does me also. To be able to answer your question as to why they would and how they can do that, I don't know, and be in good conscience.
They have to answer for all of the souls that went to that to prove that what they hold the reason they're in hell.
Oh yeah, they will be responsible for what they taught. That's what James 3 and verse 1 teaches us. I'll give you an illustration, though. When I was at Harding, one of my instructors, who became head of the Bible department, I still, every once in a while, correspond with him. He attended a cemetery down in New Orleans. And they came upon the aspect of baptism being for the remission of sins. And he said, well, and I'm paraphrasing what he said, which was a paraphrase of what his teacher said. So you're getting a paraphrase of a paraphrase. But basically, the idea was that, well, the churches of Christ, what they teach on that is what the Bible teaches, but we have X number of years of tradition on our side. Tradition. Their Baptist tradition of what they teach and what they practice. That became one. Isn't that exactly what Jesus dealt with? Look at Matthew 15. And he comes along and teaches them the truth on it, and what happens? They just simply get offended, and Jesus ends up telling his apostles who come to him and say, don't you realize you've offended the Pharisees by what you said? Well, let the blind lead the blind, and if the blind lead the blind, both will fall into the ditch. Every plant that my heavenly Father has not planted shall be rooted up and cast into the fire. Now that was Jesus' response to their, oh, you've offended them by what you said, by teaching them the truth and calling them, well, he did call them hypocrites. He did tell them their worship was vain. A few things like that. They teach that for tradition, or for commandments, the traditions of man instead of the traditions or the commandments of God. So what was the difference between that and what we're talking about tonight? Mm-hmm. They transgress the commandment of God by their tradition. That's exactly what he had expressed to that class that discussed baptism being for the remission of sins. So, why do people do that? I don't know. But you go back, several times during the Old Testament, this people's heart is waxed gross, and so forth. They will not hear.
You wonder if they think they got plenty of time to change.
No, I don't think so. I think what it is really is that they deceive themselves. They're self-deceived. How many times does the Bible say, be not deceived? Self-deceit is the worst kind, and I think they've deceived themselves.
We had a best friend that he said, you're right, I need to go, but I will when I've done a lot. And he was like 46. He dropped dead, getting ready to have a heart attack, getting ready to go to work.
There's a lot of people who will do that. Well, I'll just wait, and then at the last second I'll make everything right. Never know. Carl?
Old habits are hard to break. Look at the Pharisees and that. They were brought with the truth of Christ coming and he was going to be their Savior. And they just ignore it when he gets here.
Well, the rapidity, or how rapid it was, the quickness of it, of their turning. In 1 week, the first part of the week, what are they doing? Laying palms down in his path and saying, blessed is he that cometh in the name of the Lord. And all of that, and then by the middle of the week, or toward the end of the week, they're there yelling, crucify him, crucify him. Let his blood be on our heads, and on our children's head. Yeah. Yeah. And no doubt there's a lot of reasons, and same reasons that people have it today. You could probably narrow a lot of it down to pride, to position or power, money, things like that. So, getting back to, though, here, their wise men in Egypt had caused them to go astray. He uses a phrase here, and the idea of mingled, by the way, is mixing spices with intoxicating drinks, and thus mingled in that sense. Egypt and the wisdom it had that they were setting forth led them to like a drunken man who staggers and slips in his own vomit. That's the picture that Isaiah is drawing of Egypt. Not a very pretty picture. And just as an aside, I'm not going to go into it, but I wonder why the advertisers of alcohol don't put that type of a picture up. I think the answer is obvious. I'm just, but that's really what's going to happen to them.
You're talking about the people that do that, staggered drunk, going in their own wallet.
Mm-hmm.
Being in the army, I've seen guys come in like that, and they would swear on a stack of Bible, if you had some, I'll never drink again. Before the sun goes down the next day, they're on their way to get drunk again.
It is amazing, isn't it, how quickly that can take place. And you're right. I'll never do it again. But we see that in a lot of aspects. Verse 15, and neither shall there be any work for Egypt, which the head or tail, branch or rush may do. So the spirit of perverseness will I'll just leave it there. The spirit of perverseness will present all union of the rich and the poor, basically the upper class, the lower class, working together. So all aspects of society, all of them working together now, but nothing that all of them together can do is going to prevent what God is going to do to them. God has made his decision, and there's really nothing they can do to prevent it. Now then, verse 16. And verses 16 through verse 22 I titled as the conversion of some Egyptians to Yahweh. In that day shall Egypt be likened to women, and it shall be afraid and fear because of the shaking of the hand of the Lord of hosts, which he has shaken over it. Egypt is now being presented as timid, scared, helpless because of God's judgments and the destruction by means of the invaders. Now, the invaders are going to be the Assyrian armies, the Assyrian invasion. And that God is the author of it. We've discussed this in previous classes, that God is interested in other nations other than just the Israelites. We sometimes approach the Old Testament as, well, the Old Testament is just for the Israelites. Well, no. He dealt with other nations as well, and they were important to him. And it also teaches us the great lesson that God is in control. God's the author of this destruction. Now, we could ask the question, did the Egyptians really recognize that God is the one doing it? Probably not. Some might have. Well, now then, let me add, it really doesn't matter whether they recognized it or not. It was still a God who was bringing it upon them. They might have just saw it's the Assyrians out here and never saw the hand of God in it. And let me mention something about the providence of God today. Does God work in the affairs of man today? Yes, he does. Now, of course, when we're talking about God working in the affairs of man today, God works through either miraculous activity or providential activity. Miraculous activity has ceased. God works in the areas of providence. Can we look at something in our life or in someone else's life and say, well, this is the providence of God? No, we can't. Paul, an inspired writer of the New Testament, when he writes to Philemon, he's writing to Philemon about his runaway slave, Onesimus. And he uses the phrase, perhaps. He has, and I don't remember the exact quote, but basically, perhaps he ran away so that you can receive him back again as not simply a slave, but as a brother in Christ. In other words, this entire situation might have been the providence of God. But yet he's an inspired writer of the New Testament. Doesn't he know? Now, if an inspired writer in the New Testament doesn't know for certain that it's providence of God, but says perhaps it might be, then by what right do we think that we can state for certain this is God's providence? Esther. Yeah, Esther. For that purpose. But in the case of Mordecai talking to Esther there, that perhaps you're here for such a time as this, you might argue whether or not he was inspired in what he said. But with Paul, we know he was an inspired writer. And yet he would still say, perhaps. I might believe it to be. You might believe it to be. But to say definitively that it is the providence of God is to really go beyond what our knowledge is able to attain. Okay, Carl.
Brought up Paul. I said, that's what's wrong with these Baptists. They're waiting for Jesus to come to them on the road to Walmart. Blinders, so they'll be convinced that they're wrong.
Well, okay, I'll just leave that one alone. But whether or not Egypt knew that this was God's destruction, it was still God doing it. What if they rejected the idea that it was God's involvement? Still didn't make any difference, and it's still going to happen. That's both of those points are right. So someone might deny the providence of God today. And by the way, most Pentecostals do. They believe in miracles, and basically they, in their belief for miracles, deny the providence of God. Their viewpoint is, to a certain extent, that the only way that God works is through miraculous activity. So they deny the providence of God and fail to recognize that aspect. But it's still God's acting. Yes.
We can kind of look at our culture today and think about what's happened in the past. And the way things are going now is what's possible to happen.
You can't help but look at some of the things in our nation, especially when you get into the areas of morals and maybe I should say the immorality, and we have a nation today that is amoral. It is without any morals whatsoever. And God destroyed most of nations that had reached the state of depravity that our nation reached and has reached. He destroyed them. So you're right. Our nation better be wary. And I don't wish this really, but in some ways it would be good for our nation to have a great famine or go into great poverty or a war or something along that line. Because in those times, people's minds turn to God.
It doesn't last, so it don't seem like 9/11,
That is true. In most cases, there is not a lasting effect. It comes and it goes. When was World War II? 41 through 44? 45. 1950s, you had great moral revival. The church at that time, the Lord's church, was the fastest growing religion in the United States. It lasted a longer period of time. But you're right. After 9/11, there was a lot of talk about it, but it didn't last long. It wasn't really a lasting effect. Carl?
Yeah, because it was a one-day event where the war lasted how many years?
Right, and that was my point of bringing up the dates.
Right, and what happens is it affects the youth, and it's our upcoming generations that have been affected, where now our youth is so destroyed, where the morals are, it's just, wow. It's gonna take quite
I'm going to say it anyway. Thought about not saying this, but for a couple of decades, probably you can go back farther than that, we have been in a battle for the mind of man. And I'll put, with President Trump being elected and the things that he has done, and his mantra, of course, is we're winning, and we'll win so much we get tired of winning. In reality, he can talk about that all he wants to. We're losing. We're losing the battle, the mind of the young people. Now, how do I know that? Go to the colleges and the universities. That's where the battle's won or lost. Not in the things that happen in the Senate and the House, what the president does. Battle's not won there. Battle's won in college campuses and universities. And then you start looking at the ones who are the instructors there. And just to be very blunt about it, they are as liberal as you can get. And conservative thinking people, and I'm not saying necessarily from a religious standpoint, it would include that, but conservative thinking people are not welcome on college campuses today. Now, how did that happen? It happened way back, long before that, because the way in which things happen. Those who are the elite thinkers who influence then those who are going to be teaching at the universities, who then, because of their influence in the school or in the universities, they influence those who are going to be teaching in the high schools and the elementary schools, and they influence those individuals who are making the decisions as to what takes place in those schools. That's where it happened way back then at the very elite people who are the teachers of the teachers of the teachers.
And those universities started out as religious schools. The ones that are all around,
Harvard,
Harvard, Yale.
Yale, Stanford, all of those started out as religious institutions.
Look at David Lipscomb.
Let's not look at it. No, I know what you mean. Yes, David Lipscomb is a great illustration. If
I used to go to lectureships there when I was 8, 9, 10 years old.
to use the expression of someone who has since passed on from this world, if David Lipscomb were alive today, he'd roll over in his grave. Because he wouldn't tolerate the things that are happening there. But what happened? The instructors and the leaders of the school went to these liberal theological and these liberal educational, liberal arts colleges. They then learned their principles and come back, and it slowly made an inroad to where you see what you have now. Bill.
And even in very conservative places in like southeast Idaho, which is predominantly Mormon, there's more Mormons per capita in southeast Idaho than there are in Salt Lake City. And there was a professor of like a general science class. And he basically said anybody that believed in God was stupid. You know? And that's coming from a very conservative area.
And he's able to get away with saying things like that because of the influence that he was under, and those who influenced him and others to allow him to say it. And I say we're losing the battle because it's already been lost in those areas. You just cannot find conservative thinking people on college campuses and universities today. They are not welcome. Carl?
Yeah, it started back when you can see it when Dr. Spock, when they started taking, parents that couldn't spank their children to control them.
No, it started long before that.
Yeah, but I mean, that was a lot of effect with children, and they're
But
trying to control what your children learn, so that they could change their ideas of how to.
But the thing that I'm saying is, yes, that's in regards to the children and Dr. Spock's idiocy, but that was touted and advanced because of what had already happened. And at that time, we had already basically lost the war. We just didn't know it. In fact, we didn't even realize we were in a fight or a battle. No, not testing the waters. Not at all. No, they had already affected the water. Why? Because the intelligentsia, who had already influenced, and this goes back, if you really want to go back a ways, I believe it was 1948. Date might be wrong, but it was in the 1940s in which the first Humanist Manifesto was written. One of the signers of the Humanist Manifesto, his name was John Dewey. John Dewey had more influence on the educational system in the United States of America than any other person living or dead. Now, look at what he signed. So it goes back long before that. And they had, I don't know how many signers at that point, because the battle had already been taken over to a great extent, even at that point in time. The
Big blows I recognized was that one and abortion.
Well, abortion, again, you talk about that, same thing. It's because of what had already taken place. Now then, let me apply this to the church. Years ago, I'm trying to think of the name of the couple. The only thing I can think of is her first name. It was a married couple who did a tremendous service for those who would listen, which was very few people, because they got all of the material that was being used in the Bible classes and church from all of the different publishing companies. They then ordered also the material from the denominational groups. Guess what? It was exactly the same material. They put different covers on the outside, and they might edit out the idea of the pastor being the preacher and change that. Everything else, exactly the same. Guess what happened within the church? Because that's the material that we were using. And that was every company that sold Bible class material to the church was doing it. Then we wonder why today we're seeing congregations doing what they do and having fellowship with denominational groups and bringing in musical instrument, the advance of women's role in the church, and all of these things. Now, they did their work in I think it was the early 70s. Because I remember looking at it. They had a display out. It was obvious. I mean, you turn pages, exactly the same, exactly the same.
When that was exposed to that, they still kept using it.
Yes, brethren still kept using it. Want to know why? Lazy. Well, forget about the publishers for a second. Brethren continued to use it. Why? We don't have anything else to use. Well, that's what I was going to say, Dale. They should have used the Bible, but they didn't think about that. They couldn't use that because it would be too much work. And there's where your laziness comes in. And so they kept ordering that material with its denominational theology and thoughts. And you start getting the little children, and all through the years with that. So what are you going to have when those children grow up? Denominational thoughts, ideas in the church.
Everybody used other but Gospel Advocate.
And Gospel Advocate was one of those that just bought their material from the denominational publishing houses.
I remember even
For,
talking about going verse by verse.
mm-hmm.
They'd have somebody read the verse. The comment was, it means what it says what it means, and then they go on. That was their commentary.
Yep, that was it. It means what it says and says what it means. don't think about actually studying it and finding out here's what it means, here's what the words mean, and going through a real study. It just, well, or the other aspect was, well, so-and-so, what do you think it means? What do you think it means? What do you think it means? And nobody ever... And then when the versions started proliferating, it was, well, my Bible says this, and my Bible says this, and my Bible says this. Well, the state of the church is what we see as a result of that. Okay, real quick, Carl.
It's like when I was going to, started taking courses over here at the college in the early '90s, and during class, they interrupted our class and came in there with these speakers to tell us about thinking purple, where instead of having blue bows on boys and pink bows on baby girls, they wanted everybody to think this non-gender thoughts of purple. And now look, 10 years later, now they're trying to transform the graffiti bridge into a transgender bridge. It's just, wow.
I've got to admit, I haven't heard some of that aspect, but obviously we got those same, the transgender and all of that nonsense today that we're facing.
Probably wrong to promote children's education for that purpose.
We'll start with verse 17 then next week.